Every November, a story gets repeated across kitchen tables and elementary school classrooms that isn't quite true. A ship full of pilgrims escaped religious persecution, landed at Plymouth Rock, and sat down to a peaceful meal with the Wampanoag. That is the version most Americans grew up with. The real passenger list of the Mayflower tells a stranger story, one where fewer than half the people on board even belonged to the religious group we now call the Pilgrims. The rest were merchants, servants, craftsmen, and children who signed on for the voyage because the Virginia Company was offering land, not because they were fleeing anything. The colonists themselves had a name for this split. The religious separatists called themselves saints, and everybody else on the ship they simply called strangers. And here is the detail almost nobody mentions at Thanksgiving dinner. An estimated 35 million living Americans can trace at least one line of their family back to someone who was on that ship in 1620. If your last name sounds vaguely English and your family has been in New England, the Midwest, or anywhere along the old westward migration routes for more than 2 centuries, there is a real chance you are one of them. That single word, strangers, still shapes how this story gets told, since the version taught in most classrooms leaves out half the ship's passenger list in favor of the more flattering one. The Mayflower left Plymouth, England in September of 1620, with 102 passengers packed into a cargo ship that was never built to carry people across an ocean. It was designed to haul wine and cloth, not families. The crossing took 66 days through storms rough enough to crack a main support beam below deck, and by the time the ship reached the tip of Cape Cod, the passengers were sick, exhausted, and badly off course. Their patent authorized them to settle in Virginia. Instead, they were stranded hundreds of miles north of it, with winter closing in fast. Before anyone stepped onto land, 41 of the men aboard signed a short document called the Mayflower Compact, agreeing to govern themselves since they had landed outside the territory their patent actually covered. It is one of the earliest written systems of self-government in what would become the United States, drafted on a rocking, freezing ship by men who had no real idea whether any of them would survive the season. Half of them didn't. By the following spring, 53 of the original 102 passengers were dead, taken by scurvy, pneumonia, and starvation, during a first winter that nearly ended the entire colony before it began. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. That collapse matters more than most people realize, because it is a large part of the reason so many Americans can now claim a connection to one small ship. When a population drops that fast and then rebuilds itself from a small surviving core, geneticists and genealogists call it a founder effect. The bloodlines and surnames of the handful of families who lived through that winter got carried forward and multiplied across 4 centuries and an ever-widening web of descendants. A single surviving couple in 1621 could easily have tens of thousands of documented descendants alive today. That isn't folklore, it's basic population genealogy. The same math that explains why certain inherited traits cluster in small, isolated founding communities anywhere in the world. The Mayflower passengers were about as isolated a founding population as exists in American history, cut off from England by an ocean, and cut off from resupply for years at a stretch. And their surnames spread across the country in patterns genealogists have spent over a century tracing through the records of the General Society of Mayflower Descendants, an organization founded in 1897 specifically to verify these lines, one document at a time. So which names are we actually talking about? Below are 12 surnames carried across the Atlantic on that one battered ship, along with the stories of the people who carried them and what happened to their lines afterward. Roughly a quarter of the adults on board were part of the separatist congregation that had organized the voyage. The remaining passengers, the strangers, were ordinary English men and women chasing an economic opportunity, which is worth remembering the next time someone insists their ancestor crossed the Atlantic purely for freedom of worship. Number 12 is Billington, one of the most recognizable names on the passenger list, though not for reasons anyone would brag about at a family reunion. The Billingtons came from Lincolnshire and were strangers rather than saints, recruited by the voyage's financial backers to fill out the colony's numbers rather than for any religious conviction. John Billington sailed with his wife Eleanor and their 2 sons, Francis and John Jr., and the family started causing trouble almost immediately. While the ship was still anchored in Cape Cod Harbor, young Francis fired off a gun inside a cabin stacked with the ship's gunpowder stores, nearly setting off an explosion that could have killed everyone still aboard. His brother John Jr. later wandered off into the woods and disappeared for days before a search party found him living among a nearby native community. Their father was worse. John Billington picked fights with nearly every authority figure in the young colony, was publicly punished for insubordination on more than one occasion, and in 1630 was tried and hanged for shooting a man named John Newcomen during a dispute, making him the first person executed for murder in the Plymouth colony. It's a grim distinction, but the sheer volume of court records generated by the family's troubles is exactly what allows genealogists today to trace Billington descendants with unusual confidence, since a family that keeps ending up in front of a magistrate leaves a paper trail that a quiet, well-behaved household never does. The line survived him, though, spreading through southeastern Massachusetts and later into Connecticut, Rhode Island, and beyond, as later generations moved west with the rest of the country. If Billingtons show up moving through New England in your family tree during the 1600s, you may be looking at the descendants of the colony's first hanged criminal, a man whose own sons nearly burned the ship down before the family ever set foot on land. Later generations of Billingtons largely left the family's early reputation behind, settling into ordinary farming lives across Plymouth County for the better part of 2 centuries before joining the general westward drift of New England families in the 1800s. Number 11 is White. Susanna and William White boarded the Mayflower with their young son Resolved, and Susanna was pregnant for the entire crossing. On the 5th of November 1620, while the ship sat anchored in Cape Cod Harbor searching for a permanent place to land, she gave birth to a son. They named him Peregrine, an old word meaning one who has traveled from a foreign land, and he became the first English child born anywhere in New England. William White never got to watch his son grow up. He died during the catastrophic first winter, one of the 53 who didn't make it, along with his servants Roger and William Holbeck. Susanna remarried within months to widower Edward Winslow in what historians believe was the first wedding held inside the Plymouth colony, a practical arrangement in a settlement where a widow with young children had little chance of surviving alone. Peregrine White grew up entirely within the world he was born into, lived to the age of 83, an extraordinary lifespan for the period, and left behind a documented line of descendants that genealogists have traced through Massachusetts and across 4 centuries of New England migration. His own descendants eventually fanned out into Maine, New Hampshire, and the broader Yankee migration that carried New England families west into Ohio and beyond. If the surname White turns up in old church or land records anywhere in your family line, a baby born in a harbor before his parents had even seen dry land is worth a second look. The Whites eventually became one of the more common surnames among documented Mayflower lines, specifically because so many later families across New England happened to share the unremarkable name, which means a White surname alone is rarely enough to prove descent without additional documentation connecting a specific family branch back to Peregrine himself. Number 10 is Mullins. William Mullins traveled with his wife Alice and 2 of his children, including a teenage daughter named Priscilla, while an older son stayed behind in England to manage the family shoe business. William worked as a shoemaker and merchant back in England, and he did not survive the first winter, dying in February of 1621, along with his wife and son within weeks of each other. Priscilla was left an orphan in a half-built colony 3,000 miles from anywhere she had ever known. She went on to marry a young cooper from the ship named John Alden, and their courtship became one of the most retold stories in early American folklore, later dramatized in a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow more than 2 centuries after the fact. What the poem leaves out is how ordinary and how desperate the real circumstances were. Priscilla wasn't choosing between suitors for romance. She was a teenage girl who had lost her entire immediate family within a matter of weeks and needed to survive in a colony where half the population was already dead. She and Alden eventually had 11 children, and their descendants form one of the most thoroughly documented lines in American genealogy, running through New England, into the broader westward migration, and eventually into several notable American family trees, including a documented connection to at least one United States president through the female line. The Mullins surname itself largely disappeared from the direct line after Priscilla, but it lives on today in the family histories of thousands of Alden descendants who still trace their ancestry back to an orphan teenager from a shoemaker's family that didn't survive its first winter in America. Alice Mullins herself has left almost no trace in the surviving records beyond her death date, a reminder that the women who died in that first winter are frequently the hardest Mayflower ancestors to document at all, since colonial record keepers tended to note fathers, husbands, and sons far more carefully than wives and daughters. Number 9 is Fuller. Samuel Fuller was about the closest thing the colony had to a physician, though his actual training back in Leiden was as a wool comber and lay religious deacon, not a doctor in any formal sense. He treated the sick through that brutal first winter with whatever primitive medical knowledge existed at the time, bleeding patients and dosing them with whatever herbs and remedies the colony could scrape together, and later traveled to assist during outbreaks of illness in the neighboring Massachusetts Bay Colony as well. Fuller survived the founding years and became one of the colony's respected church elders, serving as a deacon for decades and helping ordain later ministers as the settlement grew. His descendants spread widely through New England, eventually into Vermont and upstate New York as land grew scarce along the coast, and because Fuller kept some of the only surviving personal records from the colony's earliest and most desperate years, his name appears constantly in the primary source documents historians still rely on today. That makes tracing a Fuller lineage back to Plymouth more reliably documented than almost any other surname on this list, a rare case where a family's genealogical paper trail is nearly as strong as its genetic one. His nephew, also confusingly named Samuel Fuller, later became a founding settler of Plymouth's neighboring town of Middleborough, which is one of several cases on this list where two family members with identical names have to be carefully separated by genealogists working from the original church and land records. Number 8 is Hopkins, and Stephen Hopkins had already survived one shipwreck before he ever set foot on the Mayflower. Years earlier, he had sailed for the Jamestown colony on a ship that wrecked off Bermuda, an ordeal so dramatic it is widely believed to have inspired Shakespeare's play The Tempest, and during his time stranded there, he was nearly executed for inciting a mutiny among the other survivors before his sentence was commuted. He survived that disaster, eventually reached Virginia, made it back to England, and then signed on for a second colonial voyage anyway, which makes him one of the only Mayflower passengers who had already lived through an entire prior colonial ordeal on another continent. Hopkins brought his pregnant wife Elizabeth and several children aboard the Mayflower, and during the crossing itself, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, Elizabeth gave birth to a son, the family named Oceanus. Stephen Hopkins became one of the colony's more prominent early citizens, serving as an assistant to the governor and hosting some of the first recorded diplomatic meetings with Massasoit and the Wampanoag inside his own home. His descendants are numerous enough that the Hopkins line has its own dedicated genealogical society today, and researchers have connected it to family trees reaching into 20th century entertainment and American political life. Bradford's own writing describes Hopkins as headstrong and occasionally difficult to manage, a personality that seems to have served him well through two separate colonial disasters on two different continents. Number 7 is Allerton. Isaac Allerton was one of the wealthier men aboard the ship, a tailor by trade who quickly became one of the colony's most important business assistants, working directly under Bradford to manage Plymouth's debts to the London investors who had financed the voyage in the first place. He crossed the Atlantic repeatedly on the colony's behalf over the following decade, negotiating with merchants and creditors, and along the way built trading connections that reached well beyond Massachusetts, up into the fishing settlements of Maine, and down into the young Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. Those same business dealings eventually turned against him. Allerton was accused of mixing his own private trading with the colony's shared finances, and by the 1630s his relationship with Bradford and the rest of Plymouth's leadership had soured badly enough that he left the colony entirely, resettling first in New Haven and later in New Amsterdam itself. That falling out is actually useful for tracing his descendants today because it means Allerton family lines don't stay confined to New England the way most other Mayflower surnames do. They show up early in New York and New Jersey records as well, a paper trail left by a man the Plymouth colony effectively pushed out. His daughter Mary, who also sailed on the Mayflower as a young girl, went on to become the last surviving passenger from the original voyage, living until 1699 and dying at an age that let her tell her own grandchildren what the crossing had actually been like. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Number 6 is Brewster. William Brewster served as the spiritual leader of the Separatist congregation and was by far the oldest passenger of any real influence aboard the ship, already in his 50s while most others around him were decades younger. He had spent years first in the Netherlands and earlier in England working in and around printing and postal circles, running an illegal printing press in Leiden that published religious material banned back home, a business that made him a wanted man well before he ever considered crossing the Atlantic. Brewster went on to serve as the colony's religious elder for the rest of his life, holding the congregation together through long stretches when they had no ordained minister of their own and had to rely on his preaching alone. Two of his sons, Love and Wrestling, both given deliberately Puritan names chosen for their religious meaning, sailed with him, while other family members remained behind in Europe and joined the colony only years later. Brewster lived into his 80s, a remarkable lifespan for the era, and died a respected elder of a colony that had far outlived anyone's early expectations. His descendants spread through Massachusetts, Connecticut, and across the broader migration pattern that defined colonial New England, and the Brewster name remains among the most thoroughly documented in Mayflower genealogical records because of how central he was to the colony's early religious and political life. Before his printing career, Brewster had also worked for years as an assistant to an English diplomat stationed in the Netherlands, which is where he first encountered the separatist congregation he would later help lead across the ocean. Number 5 is Winslow. Edward Winslow arrived on the Mayflower as a young printer who had worked alongside Brewster in the Netherlands, and he quickly became one of the colony's most capable diplomats. It was Winslow who walked directly into Wampanoag territory to negotiate with Massasoit, helping establish a peace agreement that held for decades and made the colony's long-term survival possible in the first place, and he later personally nursed Massasoit back to health during a serious illness, an act that strengthened the alliance between the two peoples. He later returned to England multiple times as the colony's official representative, and eventually served as governor of Plymouth on 3 separate occasions. His personal writings are among the only detailed first-hand accounts of the first harvest celebration in 1621, which means nearly everything popular culture believes about that event traces back to a handful of paragraphs Winslow wrote himself in a short pamphlet published back in London. His descendants include a documented line running through prominent New England families for generations, and the Winslow surname turns up repeatedly across later American political, literary, and business history. Winslow also brought back to England some of the first live wild turkeys and other American specimens ever exhibited there, a detail historians have used to argue that his first-hand accounts of the colony carried real weight with English audiences at a time when most news from America was second-hand rumor. He died at sea in 1655 during a naval expedition against the Spanish in the Caribbean, the only one of Plymouth's early governors who did not die on the soil of the colony he had helped build. Number 4 is Standish. Miles Standish wasn't a separatist at all. He was a professional soldier hired by the colony for his military experience, likely a veteran of England's wars in the Netherlands, and he never formally joined the religious congregation the way most other prominent passengers did. That outsider status didn't stop him from becoming one of the most important men in Plymouth's survival. Standish organized the colony's defenses from almost the moment they landed, led expeditions when diplomacy broke down, including a preemptive strike against a rival group at Wessagusset that colonists at the time believed had been planning an attack, and eventually became a military advisor across the broader Massachusetts colonies as English settlement kept expanding. He was famously short in stature, which earned him the nickname Captain Shrimp from some of his rivals, and just as famously short-tempered. Longfellow's poem about Priscilla and John Alden cast Standish as the jealous third suitor in their courtship, a dramatic flourish with little solid historical evidence behind it, though it made his name recognizable to generations of American schoolchildren who otherwise knew almost nothing else about him. His descendants spread through Massachusetts and Connecticut, and towns across New England still carry his name today, most visibly Standish, Maine. He never crossed back to England after the voyage, choosing instead to remain in the colony for the rest of his life, and he was eventually granted land at a settlement he helped found and named Duxbury, after the estate in Lancashire his family had once held claim to. Standish never learned to read or write with much confidence by his own admission, relying on Bradford and Winslow to handle the colony's paperwork while he handled everything else. Number 3 is Carver. John Carver was one of the expedition's principal financial backers, and the man chosen to be the colony's very first governor, elected the same day the Mayflower Compact was signed. He did not live to see the colony's first anniversary. In April of 1621, only months after landing, Carver collapsed while working in a field under the hot sun and died a few days later, most likely from a stroke or severe heat exhaustion. His wife Catherine, who Bradford described as inconsolable with grief, died only 5 weeks after him. The couple's own children had either died before the voyage or did not survive long after it, and an adopted boy traveling with them, Jasper Moore, had already died during the first winter. That means the Carver line, unlike nearly every other name on this list, did not continue directly through his own household at all. If your surname is Carver and your family has deep roots in New England, the connection more often traces back to other, unrelated Carver families who immigrated separately in the decades that followed. Not to the colony's first governor, whose own bloodline in Plymouth ended with him. What did survive was his estate, which passed to a young manservant in his household who had arrived on the same ship, a young man named John Howland. Bradford himself wrote that the colony mourned Carver's death as deeply as any loss it suffered that first year, noting that he had given freely of his own considerable fortune to keep the settlement fed through the winter. Number 2 is Bradford. William Bradford is the single most important source for everything we know about the Mayflower voyage, because he wrote nearly all of it down himself over decades. His manuscript, known today as Of Plymouth Plantation, is the primary first-hand account historians still rely on for almost every detail of the colony's founding, including the only surviving description of what actually happened at that first harvest gathering with the Wampanoag, and the manuscript itself has its own strange history, disappearing for a century after the Revolutionary War before turning up in a bishop's library in London and eventually being returned to Massachusetts. Bradford lost his first wife Dorothy during the voyage itself, when she fell overboard and drowned while the ship sat anchored off Cape Cod, a death some historians believe may not have been entirely accidental given how bleak the situation looked at the time. He became governor of the colony the following year, after the first governor, John Carver, died suddenly of what was likely a stroke or heat exhaustion while working in a field, and Bradford was re-elected to the position more than 30 times over the following decades, running the colony for most of his adult life in practice. Bradford's descendants number in the hundreds of thousands today, and his name carries enough historical weight that it remains one of the most researched surnames in American Mayflower genealogy, connected to family lines running through New England, the Midwest, and eventually across the entire country. He also taught himself Hebrew late in life, reportedly so he could read the Old Testament in what he considered its original language, and notes in that language still appear in the margins of his surviving papers. Even his handwriting changed noticeably over the decades, growing shakier in his final years, a small physical detail that lets historians roughly date undated fragments of his private notes. Number 1 is Howland, and it belongs to a man who almost didn't survive long enough to have any descendants at all. John Howland was a young indentured servant traveling in the household of colony leader John Carver when, during a violent storm somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, a wave threw him overboard into the freezing ocean. By pure chance, he managed to grab hold of a rope trailing from the ship, the topsail halyard, and he held on long enough for the crew to haul him back aboard with a boat hook, half drowned and reportedly barely conscious. Had he lost his grip for even a few seconds longer, an entire branch of American genealogy would simply never have existed. Howland survived, completed his term of service after Carver's death, married a fellow passenger's daughter named Elizabeth Tilley, and went on to become one of the colony's most successful landowners and a respected civic leader, serving as an assistant to the governor and helping negotiate trade agreements along the Kennebec River in present-day Maine. He and Elizabeth had 10 children who all lived to adulthood, an almost unheard-of outcome for the era when infant and childhood mortality routinely claimed half of all births. Their descendants have been documented more thoroughly than perhaps any other Mayflower family, largely through the efforts of a dedicated Howland Descendant Society, founded specifically to track the line. Genealogists estimate the Howland line alone accounts for millions of living descendants today, including several United States presidents, a number of well-known actors, and countless ordinary American families who have no idea their ancestor once dangled from a rope over the side of a ship in the middle of the Atlantic, one lost grip away from never existing at all. Modern genetic genealogists have even used Howland's well-documented line as a kind of reference case, comparing DNA samples from verified descendants to help confirm or rule out other disputed Mayflower lineages that lack the same depth of paper record. None of these 12 names tell the whole story of that ship, and none of them were the reason the colony survived at all. That credit belongs just as much to the Wampanoag people, whose knowledge of the land, whose agricultural techniques, and whose decision to engage diplomatically with the newcomers kept the settlement alive in ways the passenger list alone can't capture. Squanto, known to most Americans simply as Squanto, had learned English years earlier under circumstances involving his own kidnapping by English sailors, and it was that knowledge that let him serve as an interpreter between Bradford's colony and Massasoit's confederation at a moment when a single misunderstanding could have ended the settlement in a single afternoon. The English surnames on this list survived because of decisions made by people whose own names rarely made it into the colony's official records at all. But if one of these 10 surnames sits somewhere in your family tree, whether by direct descent or by marriage generations back, you are carrying a small, documented piece of one of the strangest and most consequential ocean crossings in American history. 35 million people can say the same thing today, and most of them have never bothered to look at what their own last name has been carrying forward all along. It's also worth remembering that a documented surname connection is not the same thing as a guarantee, Genealogical paper trails break, get misfiled, or get invented outright by an enthusiastic relative 2 generations back who wanted a better family story than the one the records actually supported. The Mayflower Society itself rejects a large share of the applications it receives every year for exactly this reason, which is part of why a verified line back to 1620 carries real weight among genealogists, rather than being treated as a given. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.